Mark Few and the Zags seem keen on adding another guard with one of their open scholarships. Could a familiar foe in Alabama's Jahvon Quinerly be the man for the job? Let's discuss.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome to the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Well, we're going to hear from head coach Chris Gerlufsen of the San Francisco Dons and his thoughts about Mark Few and Gonzaga's rumored realignment to the Big 12. We're going to listen to that to close out the show. We're also going to talk about Yvonne Ejim getting named to Canada's senior women's national team in the FIBA AmeriCup, what that means for her. But before we get into any of that, we are still talking transfer portal here on Thursday, Locked On Zags. We're going to talk about another guard the Zags could pursue. We've seen a handful of high-level guards enter the portal late in the process. Cam Spencer, of course, went to UConn. We saw Kirk Kriisa very briefly in the portal before he decided to pull back out and stay at West Virginia. Speaking of West Virginia, Joe Toussaint, we talked about him earlier this week on the podcast. Paul Mulcahy, also from Rutgers, like Cam Spencer. Mulcahy is another player the Zags have already targeted in the portal. And then we saw Jahvon Quinerly from Alabama, a player Gonzaga has played twice in the last couple of years. Guy's had a lot of success against Mark Few and the Zags. And he enters the portal as a grad transfer, somewhat surprisingly. Alabama's already lost a fair amount of guard depth this offseason. Jaden Bradley transferred out and went, of course, to Arizona to join Tommy Lloyd. And so it was a little bit of a surprise to see Quinerly enter the portal at this point. His numbers did drop last year. We'll talk a little bit about who he is. He's a 6'1" point guard from New Jersey. And yeah, we will address the height a little bit later on. One of the highest ranked players to ever come out of the state of New Jersey. 5-star prospect, started his career at Villanova, which I did not know until today, if we're being perfectly honest. Started at Villanova in the 2018-19 season, only played about 9 minutes per game in 25 contests, about 3.2 points. Then he sat out the next season in 2019-20. That was back when you had to sit out when you were transferring away from a school. So he sat out as a redshirt transfer to Alabama. Then he spent the next 3 seasons playing at Bama under Coach Nate Oates. In 2020-21, he averaged 25 minutes per game, about 13 points, 3 assists, shot 43% from deep. That was probably arguably his most successful season. The next season in 21-22, he played even more, 30 minutes per game. His points per game only went up a little bit. It went from 12.9 to 13.8. He averaged 4.2 assists, but only shot 28% from 3. And then last year, because of an influx of talent in Tuscaloosa, he played a significant amount less. He came off the bench. He was kind of a sixth man, played 21 minutes per game. Again, he was 25 as a sophomore, 30 as a junior, down to 21 last year in his senior year, went down to 8.7 points per game, still 3.6 assists, very solid distributor, shot 35.7% from deep. So for his career, he's about 10 points, 3 assists, and 34%. He started the final 6 games for Bama last year, though, and I think that's a key part of this is that he ended up getting benched to start the season. They put Jaden Bradley ahead of him in the depth chart. Of course, Brandon Miller, who wasn't really a guard, but kind of played a forward guard hybrid role for them, took a lot of minutes as well. And then Mark Sears coming in as a transfer from Ohio, ultimately put Quinerly, on the bench. But by the end of the season, apparently at the behest of Jaden Bradley, the freshman, they told the coach, hey, you should start Quinerly. He deserves to start. And in the final 6 games of the season, including into the NCAA tournament, Quinerly started. And in those final 6 games, when he started, he averaged 13 points, 3.3 assists, and that 3-point percentage ticked up to 40%. So in case there's any concern that the numbers dipping last year was a talent thing or even an injury thing, doesn't seem to be the case. It does look like a player who willingly accepted, and I guess we don't know all of the ins and outs, and of course him entering the portal could mean something, but appeared to willingly take a bench role. And then when asked to step into a starting role, to resume the role he'd had for the previous 2 seasons. He seemed to be able to do that without any kind of hitch. That is a pretty incredible ability and skill set to have. And I think when you're looking at a player to add to Gonzaga's roster right now, you're talking about a player who has that versatility to be a guy that you count on to do big things while also being a guy who maybe is playing more of a bench role, more of a behind the scenes role. Right now, we don't know who all is interested in Jahvon Quinerly. We know a few things. A full list of here are all the schools that he has heard from that we normally see from national beat writers like Adam Zagoria, Jeff Borzello, Jeff Goodman, etc. We have not seen that yet on Quinerly. We may not end up seeing that if he just chooses to go to one of the places that has reached out to him. But I think it's fairly safe to assume that a heck of a lot of programs have contacted Jahvon Quinerly. I would not be surprised, as I'm recording this right now, Thursday morning at 10 a.m., we have not heard a list and we have not heard any connection between them and Gonzaga. Unless it is known that he is going somewhere, which is possible. I wouldn't be surprised if Gonzaga has made some contact here. They contacted Paul Mulcahy, who's one of the best point guards available in the portal. They contacted Joe Toussaint, who's a 6-foot, sixth man caliber point guard, pretty similar to who Jahvon Quinerly is in a lot of ways. So it would not surprise me if Gonzaga has at least put out a feeler phone call here. This is a list from my good friend Tristan Freeman at Busting Brackets. He writes lists frequently about the teams that he thinks should most be interested or should pursue certain players. He wrote a list of 8 schools that he feels should pursue Jahvon Quinerly in the portal. Illinois, Kansas State, who has been heavily involved in the West Virginia transfers and still seems to be very active in the portal market in general. Louisville, who has contacted just about everybody that has come out. Memphis, we'll talk about them momentarily. Miami, who has a lot of replacing to do with with Isaiah Wong and Jordan Miller moving on to the NBA. Notre Dame, Rutgers and Seton Hall. Rutgers and Seton Hall make a ton of sense as they're both located in New Jersey, where Quinerly is from. Again, he was one of the highest ranked recruits in the state of New Jersey's history. So getting him back in the home state at either Rutgers or Seton Hall. Again, Rutgers, we talked about losing both of their point guards, or both their guards in Cam Spencer and Paul Mulcahy. So they're pretty desperate to get some veteran experience in there. Memphis is reportedly heavily in contention here. In fact, it wouldn't surprise me if by the time you're listening to this, especially since it's coming out a little later on a Thursday, you might be listening on Friday, you might be listening over the weekend, and it's possible that by the time you're listening to this, Jahvon Quinerly has committed to Memphis. That would not surprise me at all. It was a sudden addition into the transfer portal. Shortly after we heard about that, we heard that Memphis was really on top of it. It almost feels like it was something that was there might have been some pieces moving ahead of time. Again, not that there's anything wrong with that. There's no rules saying you can't do that for now, but it is something where I think that the wheels could be turning in that direction. But I think there's some other schools that could, should, would, will get involved here, depending on the timeline here. To me, Georgetown makes a lot of sense geographically and just in terms of needing to put some talent on that roster under new coach Kim English. Rick Pitino has not been shy about adding every single player he is capable of adding. And if they could get Quinerly, I think that they probably would over at St. John's. A few others that make sense to me: Michigan needing some help in that backcourt after not being able to land Caleb Love. West Virginia could certainly use some more guards especially if Toussaint doesn't end up returning to school. Cincinnati, moving into the Big 12, they need an influx of talent, and adding Quinerly, he'd probably be the best player on that team. And I think that would be a nice addition for them to have there. There's tons of other schools, probably 200 other schools that could realistically find a role for Jahvon Quinerly next year. He's a very talented player. But those are just a few that stand out to me. And then Gonzaga, of course, we're talking about Gonzaga here because there's a reason that this makes sense for Gonzaga as well. And I've talked about this. I talked about this with Joe Toussaint. I talked about this to an extent with Paul Mulcahy. Those of you who are everyday listeners have probably already heard me have these conversations, but it's a little tough to see a fit of a smaller guard joining a team that's going to play a lot of minutes for both Nolan Hickman and Ryan Nembhard, both guys who are not particularly big. If Quinerly were to come, he'd be playing at least 20 something minutes per game, most likely as a backup guard. A lot of 3-guard lineups potentially, but 3-guard lineups are going to be tough with Nembhard and Hickman and Quinerly. I think Venters is going to have to play a lot. I think maybe Stromer mixes in there as well. Again, I said this a lot of the same conversation we have with Toussaint. Quinerly is a good defensive player, even at his size. And he is a good 3-point shooter, although he's been a bit inconsistent throughout his career. But for the most part, he has been a very solid 3-point shooter. And he's got a lot of experience. I mean, a very veteran guy. He started his college career in 2018. So to me, those are the kind of things that I think you look for. If you do a character test, you assess it out. If you feel like, hey, this is the guy who's going to come in, willing to compete for his role, willing to settle for a bench role if that's what he ends up getting, and willing to kind of be whatever you need him to be. If you feel confident in that, it's only a 1-year thing, so he's not slow in the development of Dusty Stromer or anything like that. I think you feel pretty good about this. I think this would be a solid addition for Gonzaga. You want to add talent to your program. At any point, you have the ability to add somebody to your team who is clearly going to be in your 8-man rotation. And for Gonzaga, it feels like they could make some ads on the peripheries, make some ads for guys who aren't necessarily going to actually crack that rotation. But then you just risk losing those guys a year later. Quinerly, there's no worry about that because he's only got 1 year of eligibility left, and he's good enough that he will be in the rotation. It pushes some minutes for Dusty Stromer, which is a bit of a risk, I suppose. But you want to compete for a national championship, and adding a third guard like Jahvon Quinerly puts you in that conversation. Well, we're going to pivot here, switch gears, and end up talking about Yvonne Ejim, who is one of 12 players named to Canada's senior women's national team as they compete in the FIBA AmeriCup. We'll talk more about what that is and what her role will be after a word from today's sponsor, FanDuel. Baseball season is in full swing, and there is no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. That's because right now, new customers get a no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000. That's up to $1,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet does not win. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to join today. Zag fans, perhaps you want to make a bet regarding Marco Gonzalez and the Mariners or Eli Morgan and the Guardians. Either way, do not miss your chance to snag a no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. FanDuel, an official partner of Major League Baseball. All right, folks, I want to thank all of you for making Locked On Zags your first listen or your first watch of the day. Shout out to those everyday listeners checking us out on YouTube. Very much appreciated to each and every one of you. We got more transfer portal coverage. We got some women's scheduling updates coming up, and we got some more kind of fun off-season content coming your way as the calendar flips to July next week, all right here on the Locked On Zags podcast. For now, though, I want to talk about Yvonne Ejim, Gonzaga's best player last season, a player who's returning for next year alongside the Trung twins, Eliza Hollingsworth, everybody else coming back. Should be a really, really good women's basketball team next year. Ton of continuity for Lisa Fortier. We've talked about that a handful of times on the podcast for you everyday listeners. But right now I want to celebrate Miss Ejim because this is a tremendous accomplishment. She has been named one of 12 players on the Canada senior women's national team. They're playing in the FIBA AmeriCup championship that it starts on July 1st through July 9th. The tournament will run in León, Mexico, and the Canada is in Group B. They'll be playing Mexico, Puerto Rico, Colombia, and the Dominican Republic. And here's the deal. Here's how this works. So the AmeriCup is to help determine who's going to go to Olympic qualifiers. That's why I say this is a big deal. This is not a for-fun round-robin tournament just kind of made up of whatever players they could find that represent their country. This is to make it to the dang Olympics. That is the goal here. And Canada selected Yvonne Ejim as one of the 12 players that they want to help them get to the Olympics. The USA has already qualified and will advance. Well, the USA has already qualified for the qualifiers, if that makes sense. The best performing non-USA squad in this AmeriCup tournament will also advance to the Olympic qualifiers, which are taking place in February of 2024. So for Canada, they need to win this thing or finish second in this thing in order to advance to the Olympic qualifiers again in February. Canada finished fourth in this event in 2022. That was their best finish since 1986. They're currently ranked fifth. So they're not necessarily expected to make that jump, but they're right in the thick of it. They're right there. And this team is stacked. I went through the roster. Every single player on this team played high major college basketball, except Ejim. She's the only one who didn't play high major college basketball. Again, it's a semantics thing. Gonzaga is obviously an incredibly elite program, not just on the men's side, but of course on the women's side as well. But still, that's a really big accomplishment for her. Here are the schools of the other players on this team. Most of them have graduated, mind you. Yvonne is one of the youngest players on the team, although she is not the youngest player on the team. But you have Kayla Alexander, who went to Syracuse, now plays for the Minnesota Lynx in the WNBA. Shea Colley is a former Michigan State player. Elijah Edwards is a UConn player. Always good to be teammates with somebody who went to or is going to UConn. Nira Fields is a former UCLA player. Taya Hansen's former Oregon player. Sammy Hill, Virginia Tech, former player. Aislinn Koenig from North Carolina State. Emily Potter from Utah. Cassandra Prosper from Notre Dame. Marissa Russell from Louisville. And Silas Swords from Michigan. Silas Swords is 17. So she is a incoming player at the University of Michigan. Tremendous for her to be on this roster in this conversation as well. But for Vonnie, we've seen so many women's players already take these leaps and represent their countries. The Trung twins, of course, are a prominent example of that. They played in a 3-on-3 tournament in the Southeast Asian Games in Vietnam, representing Vietnam as the second year in a row that they've done that. And they've come back and talked about the experience and feeling the love from the fans and kind of having this like cult following in Vietnam and helping raise the kind of awareness around women's basketball, especially in these Southeast Asian countries where it's not particularly popular yet. And so for them to kind of have this role as almost ambassadors is one of the coolest things that I think Gonzaga is able to do and offer, is getting students, international students in and getting them to kind of play on this big stage and help represent their countries. And for Vonnie, getting a chance to represent her country in the AmeriCup, which is a really big deal, and potentially in the Olympics. I mean, it's not out of the realm that she will be an Olympian with Canada soon. In the next year. Like that could realistically happen if they do well in this tournament in early July. So games are mostly going to be streamed in Canada on Sportsnet. So it's going to be a little bit tough to find them, which is something that is a little bit unfortunate, but we'll try our best to have updates. I am almost positive the Zags women's basketball Twitter account at ZagWBB is going to have as many updates as they possibly can. I'm sure the Instagram account will have updates as well. So we'll continue to keep you posted there. But I've gone on record of talking about this before with the women's team, but we've seen them, so many of them participating in events this summer. Again, I talked about the Trung twins in the Southeast Asian Games. We had a handful of women on the team participating in the 3-on-3 tournament at the Olympics facility in Colorado, including Ejim, including Brenna Maxwell. And we've seen a handful of other women's basketball players doing various other things this summer as well. And then, of course, they're going to go on their international trip. We talked to Callie Stokes, a guard on that women's team, in a podcast a few weeks ago. And she talked about how excited they are to go to Greece and to go to the Czech Republic and all the places that they're getting a chance to go and play basketball this August. So Coach Fortier is really putting together a team that has a lot of world traveling, a lot of international flair. They're getting a chance to play internationally. They're getting a chance to play internationally, not just as a team, but individually. Many of the players are getting a chance to do that. And it just strikes me as something that's really going to help this team be truly bonded when they get together. I mean, they're already so much chemistry on this squad already because they have so many returnees. They're not losing very much talent from last year's roster. Michaela Williams hit the transfer portal and went to Cal, and that was a tough loss for them. But for the most part, everybody else is really kind of sticking it out and played together last year and is going to play together over the summer, or has in some cases. And so I think that we're looking at a team that didn't quite reach the threshold they wanted last year. They had a really good season, but they got underseeded as a 9 seed, and then they lost in that first round game to Ole Miss. And I think they're ready to prove some people wrong. And the WCCs, we'll see how it is next year. Portland lost a ton of talent after being good last year. BYU's out of the conference. So I think the WCC is going to be pretty weak on the women's side next year, which is not good for Gonzaga. They're going to have to play really well in the non-conference, and we're going to talk about some of the non-conference games on their schedule later this week. In fact, on Friday's episode of Locked On Zags. But for now, I think we celebrate Vonnie getting this incredible opportunity to represent her country, and we also celebrate the women's team being so willing to have these women playing in various different places across the country and getting these opportunities, because I think more than anything else, it's really going to help them be prepared for what should be a really exciting season in Spokane next year. Well, Chris Gerlufsen has thoughts. He has thoughts about BYU's departure from the WCC and the rumors surrounding Gonzaga and the Big 12. We're going to hear how he feels in an exclusive interview coming up right after this. All right, folks, finally closing out the show, talking with Chris Gerlufsen. This was an interview I conducted with him on the Locked On College Basketball podcast. So very shortly here, we're going to go over to that. On YouTube, you're going to notice the background changes for it being a different show. But for those of you on the regular audio platform, it should sound totally normal. And we're going to talk to Chris Gerlufsen about conference realignment and how that conversation has really impacted every school in America, especially going down to the WCC. So all that coming up right after this. Wanted to ask about the coaches that you coach against in the WCC, because one of the things that has always fascinated me, especially lately, about the WCC is there's this seems like a big disparity in the types of coaches or the stories of each of the coaches. You obviously have two coaches who've been there forever in Randy Bennett and Mark Few, who are, Mark Few is a future Hall of Famer. Randy Bennett is a very underrated longtime head coach. And then you have some kind of younger guys who have moved up, like Stan Johnson at LMU, Shante Leggins at UP. And then, of course, you have some older coaches who have kind of come back to the WCC level. You have Steve Lavin. You have Lorenzo Romar, of course, at Pepperdine. You have Herb Sendek at Santa Clara. And it feels like you have some like very analytically approached teams. You have some teams that are a bit more old school. It feels like a very widespread of different coaching styles in the conference. And I just wonder how that impacts you in terms of preparing for these teams, and then also kind of just learning from the various coaching styles that you get to go up against in the conference.
Yeah, number one, I think, I know you have a great appreciation for the league, but I grew up on the East Coast. So the WCC games used to be the game that you turn on late at night and kind of be half watching it as you fall asleep. And since coming to the West Coast 8 or 9 years ago, I've just been amazed in just enthused at the level of coaching in this league. And it's done nothing but get better since I've come to the West Coast. And so to give you kind of a long answer, there are no off nights.
Yeah.
You go from top to bottom in this league, and you have coaches who have achieved at the highest of high levels. You have guys who are just kind of getting their chance and breaking in, myself being one of them. But there's a tremendous differing styles across the board, but everyone is a challenge in terms of getting ready to play. And, when I first came to the West Coast, you used to be able to point out a game or two where as long as you showed up and played, you were going to win. And there are none of those nights now. And that's a credit to the schools in our conference and the coaches. It is a tremendous league from top to bottom, and one that I don't think gets enough recognition on a national landscape in terms of just the quality of coaching.
Well, I'll continue to do my best to bang the drum for the WCC. But I do want to switch to talking about realignment. Obviously, another huge talking point in college. I was going to say college basketball, but really in college football and college athletics in general over the last couple of years. We have BYU headed to the Big 12. That is a known thing, a known way that conference realignment is directly impacting the WCC. We, of course, have heard rumors about Gonzaga being involved with the Big 12. We've heard rumors about Gonzaga being involved in the Big East in the past. Like they've been in rumors around conference realignment for at least 5 years, because they were rumored to go to the Mountain West about that long ago. So this has continued to happen with them. We've seen big moves like USC and UCLA and potential future moves and conversation about San Diego State for seemingly months and months and months now. And I wonder just how much attention you give those conversations, like how much it's on the radar for you, or is it kind of just, hey, we'll prepare for who's in our league and we'll just kind of wait and see what happens after that?
I try to stay out of all that stuff because there's so many reports that come out and one of the assistants will come in the office and say, hey, did you see this about Gonzaga or did you see this about San Diego State? And probably 3 out of 4 times it's not true, what's reported on. And so, I will say this, Gonzaga being in the West Coast Conference is good for the University of San Francisco, and it's good for the rest of the conference. And, I definitely do not want to see them go anywhere. I love the challenge of having the opportunity to play the Zags and Coach Few twice or 3 times in a year. And it's good for our league. And so I'm trying to keep my fingers crossed and selfishly hope that they stay in the WCC for the greater good of our league, and we'll kind of take it day by day as it comes. Sure. But, as I said, we specifically don't want them going anywhere.
What about BYU? Because they obviously weren't, were only in the conference for about a decade or so. And certainly, I think, had hopes of having a bit more success in terms of winning conference championships. But a program that obviously has a ton of history, a ton of success, a huge fan base, a huge student population. all of that. And now they're headed to the Big 12. Certainly makes sense for them from a football perspective to be back in a power conference or to be in a power conference. But obviously a program that had a fair amount of success here and seems like a team that's going to be hard to replace in the WCC, just in terms of what they brought that was unique compared to other schools that were in the conference.
Yeah, no, it'll be interesting to see kind of what their transition looks like, right? Going from the WCC to the Big 12. I know they have really good resources. Mark Pope's a really good coach, really good person. And I anticipate them, figuring it out and achieving at a high level over the next few years. But yeah, it's going to be a hit for our league with them departing. But, if you look at where they finished in the league, it's not like we're losing a team that has been a perennial, one or two team in the league, but they've done a lot in terms of just providing a really good level of opponent. And, we'll see what the league decides to do here moving forward, whether we add another school or whether we keep it at the point that we're at right now.
Yeah, that was kind of what I was going to ask too. I think it's safe to assume that head coaches don't have much of any say of decisions like this, but I'm curious, just like, if it's something, I know you said you kind of try to stay out of it, but if it's something where you are paying attention to schools, in other local conferences like the WAC or anywhere else that Big West that may end up being in the conference, or if it's kind of like, hey, when we hear something, we'll start to prepare from that. But at this point, it's kind of just wait and see.
Yeah, that's kind of the attitude I'm taking. I think, if I was choosing who to add to the league, I don't have a specific school, but I would want to add someone that's going to have a chance to elevate our profile, and I think that's probably the most basic way to put it. Not just add a team to add a team that's going to have a chance to really elevate our league as a whole. Because I want to see the league continue to grow and be recognized on a national landscape, as I said earlier.
Coach, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show today. I really appreciate your insight, your expertise. Really looking forward to watching the San Francisco team next year, and we'll definitely be nervous for every time that they're playing the Zags, because I think this is a program that's going to make some noise next year. Thanks again.
I appreciate it, Andy. Good to catch up with you.
All right, that is going to do it for us today. Thank you again to Coach Chris Gerlufsen for joining me on Locked On College Basketball. I hope you guys enjoyed that conversation with him. Looking forward to doing more fun interview type stuff on Locked On College Basketball and hopefully here on Locked On Zags as well. So again, shoot me your suggestions if you have them. Leave comments on YouTube, leave reviews on iTunes, whatever it may be. I appreciate every single one of you for checking out the show, whether you are one of those coveted everyday listeners, whether you are somebody who is listening for the first time, 6th time, 10th time, whatever it may be. Go hit that subscribe button on YouTube if you have not done so yet. Is very, very much appreciated. Thank you all for listening. More fun stuff to close out the week. And of course, fun stuff coming your way as we get into July next week as well. But of course, as always, go Zags.